A Little Account with Swithin Hall. With a last long scrutiny at the unbroken circle of the sea, David Grief swung out of the cross-trees and slowly and dejectedly descended the ratlines to the deck. "Leo Atoll is sunk, Mr. Snow," he said to the anxious-faced mate. "If there is anything to navigation, the atoll is surely under the sea, for we've sailed clear over it twice. Or the spot where it ought to be. It's either that or the chronometer's gone wrong, or I've forgotten my navigation." "It must be the chronometer," the mate reassured his owner. "I made separate sights and worked them up, and they agreed with yours." "Yes," Grief muttered, nodding glumly. "And where your summer lines crossed, and mine too, was the dead centre of Leo Atoll. It must be the chronometer. Slipped a cog or something." He made a short pace to the rail and back, and cast a troubled eye at the Uncle Toby's wake. The schooner, with a fairly strong breeze on her quarter, was logging 9 or 10 knots. "Better bring her up on the wind, Mr. Snow. Put her under easy sail and let her work to windward on 2-hour legs. It's thickening up. I don't imagine we can get a star observation tonight. We'll just hold our weather position, get a latitude sight tomorrow, and run Leo down on her own latitude. That's the way all the old navigators did." Broad of beam, heavily sparred, with a high freeboard and a bluff Dutchy bow, the Uncle Toby was the slowest, tubbiest, safest, and most foolproof schooner David Grief possessed. Her run was in the Banks and Santa Cruz groups, and to the northwest among the several isolated atolls where his native traders collected copra, hawksbill turtle, and an occasional town of pearl shell. Finding the skipper down with a particularly bad stroke of fever, Grief had relieved him and taken the Uncle Toby on her semi-annual run to the atolls. He had elected to make his first call at Leo, which lay furthest out, and now found himself lost at sea with a chronometer that played tricks. No stars showed that night, nor was the sun visible the next day. A stuffy, sticky calm prevailed, broken by big wind squalls and heavy downpours. From fear of working too far to windward, the Uncle Toby was hove to, and 4 days and nights of cloud-hidden sky followed. Never did the sun appear, and on the several occasions that stars broke through, they were too dim and fleeting for identification. By this time, even a landlubber could sense that the elements were preparing to break loose. Grief, coming on deck from consulting the barometer, which remained steadily at 29.90, encountered Jacky, whose face was as brooding and troublous as the sky and air. Jacky, a Tongan sailor of experience, served as a sort of boatswain and semi-second mate over the mixed Kanaka crew. "Big weather he come, I think," he said. "I see him just the same before, maybe 5-6 times." Grief nodded. "Hurricane weather all right, Jacky. Pretty soon barometer go down, bottom fall out." "Sure," the Tongan concurred. "He going to blow like hell." 10 minutes later, Snow came on deck. "She started," he said. 29.85, going down and pumping at the same time. Sure is hot. Don't you notice it?" He brushed his forehead with his hands. "I could lose my breakfast without trying." Jacky grinned. "Just the same me. Everything inside walk about. Always this way before big blow. But Uncle Toby all right. He go through anything." "Better rig that storm trysail on the main and a storm jib," Grief said to the mate, "and put all the reefs into the working canvas before you furl down. No telling what we may need. Put on double gaskets while you're about it." In another hour, the sultry oppressiveness steadily increasing and the stark calm still continuing, the barometer had fallen to 29.70. The mate lacked further patience. He ceased his restless pacing and waved his arms. "If she's going to come, let her come," he cried. "There's no use waiting like this. Whatever the worst is, let's have it. A fine fix, lost with a crazy chronometer and a hurricane that won't blow." The cloud-mussed sky turned a vague copper colour and seemed to glow like the inside of a huge heated cauldron. Nobody remained below. The native sailors formed in anxious groups amidships and forward, talking in low voices and gazing apprehensively at the ominous sky and the equally ominous sea that breathed in long, low, oily undulations. "Looks like petroleum mixed with castor oil," the mate grumbled and spat his disgust overside. "My mother used to dose me with stuff like that when I was a kid. Lord, it's sure getting black." The lurid coppery glow had vanished, and the sky thickened and lowered until the darkness resembled a late twilight. David Grief, who knew hurricane symptoms well, nevertheless reread the laws of storms, screwing his eyes in the faint light in order to see the print. There was nothing to be done, save wait for the wind, so that he might know how he lay in relation to the fast-flying and deadly centre that was approaching from somewhere out in the gloom. It was 3 in the afternoon, with the glass sunk to 29:45, when the wind came. They could see it on the water, darkening the face of the sea, crisping tiny whitecaps as it rushed along. It was merely a stiff breeze, and the Uncle Toby, filling away under her storm canvas till the wind was abeam, sloshed along at a 4-knot gait. "No weight to that," Snow sneered, "and after such grand preparation." "Baby wind," Jackie noted. "He grow big man pretty quick, you see." Grief ordered the foresail put on, retaining the reefs, and the Uncle Toby mended her pace in the rising breeze. The wind quickly grew to man-size, but did not stop there. It merely blew hard, and harder, and kept on blowing harder, advertising each increase by lulls, followed by fierce, freshening gusts. Ever it grew, until the Uncle Toby's rail was more often pressed under than not, while her waist boiled with foaming water which the scuppers could not carry off. Grief studied the barometer, still falling steadily. "The centre's to the south'ard," he told Snow, "and we're running across its path and into it. Now we'll turn about and run the other way. That ought to bring the glass up. Take in the foresail. It's more than she can carry already. And stand by a wearer around." The manoeuvre was accomplished, and through a gloom almost like the darkness of evening, the Uncle Toby turned and raced madly north across the face of the storm. "It's nip and tuck," Grief confided to the mate a couple of hours later. "The storm's swinging a big curve. There's no calculating that curve, and we may get across, or the centre may catch us. Oh, thank the Lord the glass is holding its own. It all depends on how big the curve is. The sea's too big for us to keep on. Heave her to. She'll keep working along out anyway." "I thought I knew what wind was," Snow shouted in his owner's ear next morning. "This isn't wind. It's impossible. It must reach 90 or 100 miles an hour in the gusts. That don't mean anything. How could I ever tell it to anybody? I couldn't. And look at that sea. I've run my easting down, but I've never saw anything like that." Day had come, and the sun should have been up an hour, yet the best it could produce was a sombre semi-twilight. The ocean was a stately procession of moving mountains. 1/3 of a mile across yawned the valleys between the great waves. Their long slopes, shielded somewhat from the full fury of the wind, were broken by systems of smaller white-capping waves. But from the high crests of the big waves themselves, the wind tore the whitecaps as they were forming. This spume drove masthead high, horizontally above the surface of the sea. "We're through the worst," was Grief's judgment. "The glass is coming along all the time. The sea will get bigger as the wind eases down. I'm going to turn in. Watch for shifts in the wind. They're sure to come. Call me at 8 bells. By mid-afternoon, in a huge sea with the wind after its last shift no more than a stiff breeze, the Tongan boatswain sighted a schooner bottom up. The Uncle Toby's drift took them across the bow, and they could not make out the name, but before night they spotted a small, round-bottomed double-ender boat, swamped, but with white lettering visible on its bow. Through the binoculars, Snow made out Emily L. No. 3. "A sealing schooner," Grief said. "But what a sealer's doing in these waters is beyond me." "Treasure hunters, maybe," Snow speculated. The Sophie Sutherland and the Herman were sealers. You remember, chartered out of San Francisco by fellas with maps. The kind who can always go to the right spot, until they get there and don't. After a giddy night of grand and lofty tumbling, in which, over a big and dying sea, without a breath of wind to steady her, the Uncle Toby rolled every person on board sick to his stomach, a light breeze sprang up, and the reefs were shaken out. By midday, on a smooth ocean floor, the clouds thinned and cleared, and sights of the sun were obtained. The observation gave 2 degrees and 15 minutes south, but with a broken chronometer, longitude was out of the question. "We're anywhere within 500 and 1,000 miles along that latitude line," Grief remarked, as he and his mate bent over the chart. "Low is to the south'ard somewhere, and this section of ocean is all blank. There's neither an island nor a reef by which we can regulate the chronometer. The only thing to do—" "Land ho, skipper!" Jackie called down the companionway. Grief took a quick glance at the empty blank of the chart, whistled in surprise, and sank back feebly in a chair. "It gets me," he said. "There can't be land around here. The whole voyage has been crazy. Will you kindly go up, Mr. Snow, and see what's ailing Jackie?" "It's land, all right," the mate called down a minute afterward. "You can see it from the deck. Tops of coconuts, an atoll of some sort. Maybe it's low after all." Grief, coming up, shook his head positively as he gazed at the fringe of palms, only the tops visible, apparently rising out of the sea. "All up on the wind, Mr. Snow, close and by, and we'll take a look. We can just reach past to the south, and if it spreads off in that direction, we'll hit the southwest corner." Palms must be very near to be seen from the low deck of a schooner, and the Uncle Toby quickly raised the low land above the sea, while more palms increased the definition of the atoll circle. "She's a beauty," the mate remarked. "A perfect circle. Looks as if it might be 8 or 9 miles across. Wonder if there's an entrance to the lagoon. Who knows? Maybe it's a brand new discovery." They coasted up the west side of the atoll, making short tacks in to the surf-pounded coral rock, and out again. From the masthead, across the palm fringe, a Kanaka announced the lagoon and a small island in the middle. "I know what you're thinking," Grief said to his mate. Snow, who had been muttering and shaking his head, looked up with a quick and challenging incredulity. "You're thinking the entrance will be on the northwest," Grief went on, as if reciting. 2 cable lengths wide, marked on the north by 3 separated coconuts, and on the south by pandanus trees. 8 miles in diameter, a perfect circle, with an island in the dead centre." "I was thinking that," Snow acknowledged. "And there's the entrance opening up just where it ought to be." "And the 3 palms," Snow almost whispered. "And the pandanus trees. If there's a windmill on the island, it's it! Swithin Hall's Island. But it can't be. Everybody's been looking for it for the last 10 years.
File 2.
"Hall played you a dirty trick once, didn't he?" Grief queried. Snow nodded. "That's why I'm working for you. He broke me flat. Downright robbery. I bought the wreck of the Cascade down in Sydney, out of the first instalment of a legacy from home." "She went aground on Christmas Island, didn't she?" "Full tilt, iron dry, in the middle of the night. They saved the passengers and the mail," Snow added. "Then I bought a little island schooner, which took the rest of my money, and I had to wait the final payment by the executors to fit her out. Meanwhile, what did Swithin Hall do? He was at Honolulu at the time, but make a straightway run for Christmas Island. He had neither right nor title, but when I finally got there, the hulls and engines were all we had left of the Cascade. She had a fair shipment of silk on board too, and it wasn't even damaged. His supercargo gave it to me pretty straight afterward. All cleared something like $60,000. Snow shrugged his shoulders and gazed bleakly at the smooth surface of the lagoon, where tiny wavelets danced in the afternoon sun. "The wreck was mine! I bought her at public auction. I'd gambled big, and I'd lost. When I got back to Sydney, the crew and some of the tradesmen who'd extended me credit attached the schooner. I pawned me watch and sextant, shovelled coal a spell, and finally got a berth in the New Hebrides at $40 a month. Then I tried my luck as an independent trader, went broke, took a mate's berth on a recruiter down to Tanner and over to Fiji, got a job as overseer on a German plantation back of Alpea, and finally settled down on the Uncle Toby." "Have you ever met Swithin Hall?" Snow shook his head. "Well, you're likely to meet him now. There's his windmill." In the centre of the lagoon, as they emerged from the passage, they spotted a small, densely wooded island, on which a large Dutch windmill showed plainly. "Nobody at home from the looks of it," Grief said. "Or you might have a chance to collect." The mate's face set vindictively, and his fists clenched. "Can't touch him legally. He's got too much money now. But I can take $60,000 worth out of his hide. I hope he's home." "And I hope he is too," Grief said, with an appreciative smile. "You got the description of this island from Bao Oti, I suppose?" "Yes, as pretty well everybody else has. The trouble is that Bao Oti can't give latitude or longitude. Says they sailed a long way from the Gilberts, that's all he knows. I wonder what became of him." "Oh, I saw him a year ago on the beach at Tahiti. Said he was thinking about shipping for a cruise through the Tuamotus." "Well, here we are, getting close in. Heave the lead, Jackie. Stand by to let go, Mr. Snow. According to Bao Oti, anchorage 300 yards off the west shore and 9 fathoms, coral patches to the southeast." "Ah, there are the patches. What do you get, Jackie?" 9 fathom. Let go, Mr. Snow." The Uncle Toby swung to her chain. Headsails ran down, and the Kanaka crew sprang to the fore and main halyards and sheets. The whaleboat laid alongside the small coral stone landing pier, and David Grief and his mate stepped ashore. "You'd think the place deserted," Grief said, as they walked up a sandy path to the house. "But I smell a smell that I've often smelled. Something doing, or my nose is a liar. The lagoon is carpeted with shell, and they're rotting out the meat. Get that whiff?" Like no dwelling in the tropics was this house of Swithin Halls. Of mission architecture, when they had entered through the unlatched screen door, they found decoration and furniture of the same mission style. The floor of the big living room was covered with the finest Samoan mats. There were couches, window seats, cosy corners, and a billiard table. A sewing table and a sewing basket, spilling over with sheer linen, tokened a woman's presence. By screen and porch, the blinding sunshine was subdued to a cool, dim radiance. The shine of pearl push-buttons caught Grief's eye. "Storage batteries, charged by the windmill," he exclaimed as he pressed the buttons. "And indirect lighting." Hidden bulbs glowed, and the room was filled with a diffused golden light. Many shelves of books lined the walls. Grief ran over their titles. A fairly well-read man himself for a sea adventurer, he glimpsed a wideness of range and breadth of taste that were beyond him. Old friends he met, and others he had heard of but never read. There were complete sets of Tolstoy, Turgenev, and Gorky, of Cooper and Mark Twain, of Hugo, Zola, and Sue, of Flaubert, de Maupassant, and Paul de Koch. He glanced curiously at the pages of Metchnikoff, Weininger, and Schopenhauer, and wonderingly at those of Ellis, Lydston, Krafft-Ebing, and Forel. Woodruff's Expansion of Races was in his hands when Snow returned from further exploration of the house. "Enamelled bathtub, separate shower and a sitz bath," he exclaimed. "Fitted up for a king! I reckon some of my money went to pay for it. The place must be occupied. I found fresh oaten butter and milk tins in the pantry, and fresh turtle meat hanging up. I'm going to see what else I can find. Grief, too, departed through a door that led out the opposite end of the living room. He found himself in a bedroom. Across it, he peered through a wire mesh door into a screened and darkened sleeping porch. On a couch lay a woman asleep. By her side, opened and face downward, a novel lay on a chair. From the colour in her cheeks, Grief concluded that she had not been long in the tropics. After the one glimpse, he stole softly back, in time to see Snow re-entering the living room through the other door. By the naked arm, he was clutching an age-wrinkled native, who grinned in fear and made signs of dumbness. "I found him snoozing out the back," the mate said. "He's the cook, I suppose. Can't get a word out of him. What did you find?" "A sleeping princess." "Oh, shh! There's someone now." "If it's all," Snow muttered, clenching his fist. Grief shook his head. "No roughhouse. There's a woman here. And if it is Hall, before we go, I'll manoeuvre a chance for you to get action." The door opened, and a large, heavily built man entered. In his belt was a heavy, long-barreled Colt. One quick, anxious look he gave them. Then his face wreathed in a genial smile, and his hand was extended. "Welcome, strangers. But if you don't mind my asking, how, by all that's sacred, did you ever manage to find my island?" "We were off course," Grief answered, shaking hands. "My name's Hall, Swithin Hall," the other said, turning to shake Snow's hand. "And I don't mind telling you, you're the first visitors I've ever had." "And this is your secret island home that's had all the beaches talking for years," Grief answered. "Well, I know the formula now for finding it." "And how's that?" Hall asked quickly. "Smash your chronometer, get mixed up with a hurricane, and then keep your eyes open for coconuts rising out of the sea." "And what is your name?" Hall asked, after he had laughed perfunctorily. "Anstey, Phil Anstey," Grief answered promptly. "Bound on the Uncle Toby from the Gilberts to New Guinea, and trying to find my longitude. This is my mate, Mr. Gray, a better navigator than I, but who has lost a round to the chronometer." Grief did not know his reason for lying, but he had felt the prompting and succumbed to it. He vaguely divined that something was wrong, but could not place his finger on it. Swithin Hall was a fat, round-faced man with a laughing lip and laughter wrinkles in the corners of his eyes, but Grief, in his youth, had learned how deceptive this type could prove, as well as the deceptiveness of blue eyes that screened the surface with fun and hid what went on behind. "What are you doing with my cook? Lost yours and trying to Shanghai him?" Hall was saying. "You'd better let him go if you're going to have any supper. My wife's here, and she'll be glad to meet you. Dinner, she calls it, and scolds me for misnaming it, but I'm old-fashioned. My folks always ate dinner in the middle of the day. Can't get over early training." "Well, don't you want to wash up?" "I do. Look at me. I've been working like a dog, out with the diving crew. Shell, you know, but of course you smelt it." Snow pleaded duties on the schooner and went on board. In addition to his repugnance at breaking bread with the man who had robbed him, it was necessary for him to impress the inviolability of Grief's lies on the Kanaka crew. By 11 o'clock, Grief came on board to find his mate waiting up for him. "There's something doing on Swithin Hall's island," Grief said, shaking his head. "I can't make out what it is, but I get the feel of it. What does Swithin Hall look like?" Snow shook his head. "That man ashore there never bought the books on those shelves," Grief declared with conviction. "Nor did he ever go in for indirect lighting. He's got a surface flow of suavity, but he's as rough as a rasp underneath. He's an oily bluff. And the bunch he's got with him, Watson and Gorman, they came in after you left, are real sea dogs. Middle-aged, marred and battered, tough as rusty nails and twice as dangerous. Real ugly customers with guns in their belts who don't strike me as just the right sort to be on such comradely terms with Swithin Hall. And the woman! She's a lady. She knows a whole lot of South America and of China, too. I'm sure she's Spanish, though her English is natural. She's travelled. We talked bullfights. She's seen them in Guayaquil, in Mexico, in Seville. She knows a lot about seal skins. Now, here's what bothers me. She knows music. I asked her if she played, and he's fixed that place up like a palace. That being so, why hasn't he a piano for her? Another thing, she's quick and lively, and he watches her whenever she talks. He's on pins and needles, continually breaking in and leading the conversation. Say, did you ever hear that Swithin Hall was married? I really don't know, the mate replied. Never entered my head to ask about it. He introduced her as Mrs. Hall. Watson and Gorman call him Hall. They're a queer pair, those two men. I don't understand it at all. What you going to do? Snow asked. Hang about a while. There are some books ashore that I want to read. Suppose you send that topmast down in the morning and generally overhaul. We've been through a hurricane, you know. Set up the rigging while you're about it. Get things pretty well adrift and take your time.
File 3.
The next day, Grief's suspicions found further nourishment. Ashore early, he strolled across the little island to the barracks occupied by the divers. They were just boarding the boats when he arrived, and it struck him that for Kanakas they behaved more like chain-gang prisoners. The 3 white men were there, and Grief noted that each carried a rifle. Hall greeted him jovially enough, but Gorman and Watson scowled as they grunted curt "good mornings." A moment afterward, one of the Kanakas, as he bent to place his oar, favoured Grief with a slow, deliberate wink. The man's face was familiar, one of the thousands of native sailors and divers he had encountered while drifting about in the island trade. "Don't tell him who I am," Grief said in Tahitian. "Did you ever sail for me?" The man's head nodded, and his mouth opened, but before he could speak, he was suppressed by a savage "Shut up!" from Watson, who was already in the stern sheets. I beg pardon," Grief said. "Oh, that's all right," Hall interposed. "The trouble is, they're too much talk and not enough work. Have to be severe with them, or they wouldn't get enough shell to pay their grub." "What was you saying to 'em?" Gorman blurted in bluntly. "I was asking how the shell was and how deep they were diving." "Thick," Hall took over the answering. "We're working now in about 10 fathom. It's right out there, not 100 yards off. Want to come along?" Half the day Grief spent with the boats, and then had lunch in the house. In the afternoon he loafed, taking a siesta in the living room, reading and talking for half an hour with Mrs. Hall. After dinner he played billiards with her husband. Swithin Hall's fame at billiards was the talk of the beaches from Levuka to Honolulu, but the man Grief played with this night proved most indifferent at the game. His own wife showed herself far cleverer with a cue. When he went on board the Uncle Toby, Grief routed Jackie out of bed. He described the location of the barracks and told the Tongan to swim softly around and have a talk with the Kanakas. In 2 hours, Jackie was back. He shook his head as he stood dripping before Grief. "Very funny thing," he reported. "One white man stop all the time. He has big rifle. He lay in water and watch. Maybe 12 o'clock, other white man come and take rifle. First white man go to bed. Other man stop now with the rifle. No good. Me cannot talk with Kanakas. Me come back." "Well, that does it," Grief said to Snow, after the Tongan had gone back to his bunk. "I smell something more than shell." Those 3 men are standing watches over their Kanakas. That man's no more Swithin Hall than I am. Snow whistled from the impact of the new idea. I've got it, he cried. And I'll name it, Grief retorted. It's in your mind that the Emily L. was their schooner? Just that. They're raising and rotting the shells for pearls, while she's gone for more divers or provisions or both. And I agree with you. Grief glanced at the cabin clock and started getting ready for bed. He's a sailor. The 3 of them are. But they're not island men. They're new in these waters. Again, Snow whistled. And the Emily L. is lost with all hands, he said. We know that. They're marooned here till Swithin Hall comes. Then he'll catch them with all the pearls. Or they'll take possession of his schooner. Hope they do, Snow muttered vindictively. Somebody ought to rob him. Wish I was in their boots. I'd balance off that 60,000. A week passed, during which time the Uncle Toby made ready for sea, while Grief managed to allay any suspicions by the shore crowd. Even Gorman and Watson accepted him at his self-description. Throughout the week, Grief begged and badgered for the longitude of the island. You wouldn't have me leave here lost, he finally urged. I can't get a line on my chronometer without your longitude. Hall laughingly refused. Yeah, you're too good a navigator, Mr. Anstey, not to fetch New Guinea or some other high land. And you're too good a navigator, Mr. Hall, Grief replied, not to know that I can fetch your island any time by running down its latitude. On his last evening ashore, to dinner as usual, Grief finally got a view of the pearls he suspected they had been collecting. Mrs. Hall, impulsively dropping the veil of secrecy, asked her husband to bring them out, and then had spent half an hour showing them to Grief. His delight in them was as genuine as his surprise that they had made so rich a haul. The lagoon is virgin, Hall explained. You saw yourself that most of the shell is large and old, but it's funny that we got most of the valuable pearls in one small patch in the course of a week. It was a little treasure house. Every oyster in the lagoon seemed filled. Seed pearls by the quart, of course, but the perfect ones, most of that bunch there, came out of the small patch. Grief ran his eye over them and knew their value ranged from $100 to $1,000 each, while several large ones went far beyond. "Oh, the pretties, the pretties!" Mrs. Hall cried, bending forward suddenly and kissing them. A few minutes later, she rose to say good night. "It's goodbye," Grief said as he took her hand. "We sail at daylight." "So suddenly," she cried, while Grief could not help seeing the quick light of satisfaction in her husband's eyes. "Yes," Grief continued, "all the repairs are finished. I can't get the longitude of your island out of your husband, though I'm still hoping he'll relent." Hall laughed and shook his head, and as his wife left the room, proposed a last farewell nightcap. They sat over it, smoking and talking. "What do you estimate they're worth?" Grief asked, indicating the spread of pearls on the table. "I mean, what the pearl buyers would give you in the open market." "Oh, 75 or 80,000, Hall said carelessly. "I'm afraid you're underestimating. I know pearls a bit. I mean, take that biggest one. It's perfect. Not a cent less than $5,000. Some millionaire will pay double that someday when the dealers have taken their cut. And not counting the seed pearls, you've got quarts of baroques there. Baroques are coming into fashion. They're doubling in value every year." Hall gave the trove of pearls a closer and longer scrutiny, estimating the different parcels and adding the sum aloud. "You're right," he admitted. "They're worth 100,000 right now." "And at what do you figure your working expenses?" Grief went on. "Your time and your 2 men's, and the divers." 5,000 would cover it." "Then they stand to net you 95,000? Something like that. But why so curious?" "Why, I was just trying—" Grief paused and drained his glass. "Just trying to reach some sort of an equitable arrangement. Suppose I should give you and your people a passage to Sydney and the $5,000, or better, $7,500. You've worked hard." Without commotion or muscular movement, the other man became alert and tense. His round-faced geniality went out like the flame of a snuffed candle. No laughter clouded the surface of the eyes, and in their depths showed the hard, dangerous soul of the man. He spoke in a low, deliberate voice. "Now just what the hell do you mean by that?" Grief casually relighted his cigar. "I don't know just how to begin," he said. "The situation is embarrassing for you. You see, I'm trying to be fair. As I say, you've worked hard. I don't want to confiscate the pearls. I want to pay you for your time and trouble and expense." Conviction, instantaneous and absolute, froze on the other's face. "And I thought you were vacationing in Europe," he muttered. Hope flickered for a moment. "Look here, you're joking with me. How do I know you're Swithin Hall?" Grief shrugged his shoulders. "Such a joke would be in poor taste after your hospitality, and it is in equally poor taste to have two Swithin Halls on the island." "Well, since you're Swithin Hall, then who the devil am I? Do you know that too?" "No," Grief answered airily, "but I'd like to know." "Well, it's none of your business." "I grant it. Your identity is beside the point. Besides, I know your schooner, and I can find out from that." "What's her name?" "The Emily L." "Correct. I'm Captain Raffi, owner and master." "Ah, the seal poacher. I've heard of you. What under the sun brought you down here?" "Needed money. The seal herds are about finished." "And these out-of-the-way places of the world are more poorly policed, eh?" "Pretty close to it. And now about this present scrape, Mr. Hall. I can put up a nasty fight. What are you going to do about it?" "What I said." "Even better. What's the Emily L. worth?" "She's seen her day. Not above 10,000, which would be robbery. Every time she's in a rough sea, I'm afraid she'll jump her ballast through the planking." "She has jumped it, Captain Raffi. I sighted her bottom up after the blow." "Suppose we say she was worth 7,500. I'll pay over to you 15,000 and give you a passage." At that, Grief, with a sudden movement, swept the Colt from Captain Raffi's belt. "Just a necessary precaution, Captain. Now, you'll go on board with me. I'll break the news to Mrs. Raffi afterward and fetch her out to join you." "You're behaving handsomely, Mr. Hall, I must say," Captain Raffi volunteered as the whaleboat came alongside the Uncle Toby. "But watch out for Gorman and Watson. They're ugly customers. And by the way, I don't like to mention it, but I'd given my wife 4 or 5 pearls. Watson and Gorman were willing." Say no more, Captain. Say no more. They shall remain hers." "Is that you, Mr. Snow? Here's a friend I want you to take charge of. Captain Raffi." "I'm going ashore for his wife." David Grief sat at Swithin Hall's library table, writing. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was showing. Grief had had a busy night. Mrs. Raffi had taken 2 hysterical hours to pack her and Captain Raffi's possessions. Gorman had been caught asleep, but Watson, standing guard over the divers, had shown fight. Matters did not reach the shooting stage, but only after it had been demonstrated to him that the game was up did he consent to join his companions on board. For temporary convenience, he and Gorman were shackled in the mate's room. Mrs. Raffi was confined in Grief's, and Captain Raffi was made fast to the cabin table. Grief finished the document and read over what he had written. From Swithin Hall in pearls taken from his lagoon, estimated. $100,000. To Herbert Snow, paid in full for salvage from steamship Cascade, in pearls, estimated, $60,000. To Captain Raffy, salary and expenses for collecting pearls, $7,500. To Captain Raffy, reimbursement for schooner Emily L., lost in hurricane, $7,500. To Mrs. Raffy, for goodwill, 5 fair pearls, estimated, $1,100. To passage to Sydney, 4 persons at $120, $480. To white lead for painting Swithin Hall's 2 whaleboats, $9. To Swithin Hall, balance in pearls, estimated, to be found in drawer of library table, $23,411. Total, $100,000. Balance, $0. Grief signed and dated, paused, and added at the bottom. P.S. Still owing to Swithin Hall 3 books borrowed from library. Hudson's Law of Psychic Phenomena, Zola's Paris, and Mahan's Problem of Asia. These books, or full value, can be collected of said David Grief's Sydney office. He switched off the electric light, picked up the bundle of books, carefully latched the front door, and went down to the waiting whaleboat. The end.